Mr. Owen Garrison of Bridgeton, New Jersey, who was on board the USS Monterey during World War II. It's nice to have you with us, Owen.
Thank you.
Okay, can we start by you telling us how you had got into the Navy?
Oh, yeah. How I got into the Navy. I was a 10th grader in high school. Springtime. I flunked my first English test, and along with a buddy of mine, we both flunked our English test. We decided it was time to enlist in the Navy. And back in 1943, Navy enlistments were closed. You had to be shiny like a new car. Eyes had to be perfect. Dental work had to be perfect. So I foot my own expense, made myself shiny like a new car, and then the Navy took me. And that was Mother's Day, 1943.
That was May of 43.
May of 43.
Okay, and okay, so you enlisted, and where did you go
Off
for basic
to,
training?
well, the route of travel was from Bridgeton to Atlantic City, overnight in Atlantic City at the Y. Next morning, we boarded a train for New York. When we got to New York, they put us on a big train called the Erie Lackawanna. And that was a troop train through to Great Lakes Naval Training Station. Would you believe it took 3 days by train to go from New York City, just across 2 other states, to Great Lakes Naval Training Station? Troop trains were crowded. But somehow or other, I got hooked up with a buddy in travel, and come find out his father worked for Erie Lackawanna, so we had a stateroom all the way to Wisconsin for the Great Lakes Naval Training Station. Made our ride more pleasant.
I'll bet.
And at Great Lakes, I was lucky enough to get into a department which I wound up as a lifeguard and swimming instructor my whole boot camp training. So I did very little marching. The only thing I didn't like about it, it was in the summertime, so to speak, here, and we had to take hatchets and break the ice on Lake Superior to put the whaleboats in to do boat practice. It was that cold up there.
I'll bet you didn't do much swimming instruction then, in the wintertime.
Well, see, we had Great Lakes at that time had the world's largest indoor swimming pool. And what we did, they had a catwalk in the ceiling, 50 feet. And what you did, you took the new recruits up onto the catwalk. It had to simulate the side of a ship in distress. And if the guys didn't jump, they got pushed. Now, picture, if you will, these guys weren't wearing any swimming trunks, and that water sort of stung the private parts when you hit the pool. But back then, there were no females in the service, so it was not co-ed like it is today.
So how long were you in basic training? In,
I spent my full 16 weeks there in basic training, and I left Great Lakes the first week of July with orders to pick up a ship called the Monterey at Norfolk, Virginia, Norfolk Navy Yard. And from there we went on Shakedown cruise to Trinidad. That's Shakedown cruise where they take a ship, brand new ship, and take it out for a road test. And that's where if you find out anything's wrong with it, when you come back into port, they fix it, and then it's off to the theater of war.
All right, right, and what was your duties on board the Monterey at the time of the Shakedown cruise?
Well, at the time of the Shakedown cruise, they had a thing called battle stations. All hands man your battle stations. So, being new on board, I didn't know what they were even talking about. So I asked the chief what I was supposed to do, and being the good chief that he was, he said, "Come on, follow me." So he took me back to the back part of the ship called the fantail. And he gave me a white suit with a hard hat helmet. I said, "That's fine. What'll I do with it?" Well, when an airplane comes in, if the pilot misses and he crashes, catches fire, you got to put this suit on and go into fire and get him, bring him out. And whoa, wait a minute, time out. Until that time, the nearest thing I had been to a fire was a weenie roast at the beach. I had never been a firefighter, didn't know the first thing to do. So I was lucky. I got out of that and they switched me. So they told me, being I wouldn't make out in that department, onboard ship you could make transfer from one department to the next, called bilateral transfers. As long as you didn't leave the ship, they would move you around to where you were best fitted. And I got out of that department and they said, "Well, try the radio room." So I did, and I was in the radio room probably about 6 months. But I couldn't master the dots and the dots and typing. So when it come general quarters, they put me in a little cubicle like about a 4x4 and told me I was 5 decks below the waterline. So I didn't have to worry about a fire. But yet on this wall, there was a sign that said, "No smoking, powder magazine." And I turned around and I looked, and there was one in back of me that said, "No smoking, aviation gas." And I thought, here I am, roasty toasty in a little cubicle. I didn't like that. I figured if I was going to be in combat and going to get it, I wanted to see it coming. So I had to wait in line, but I finally got to be a loader on a 40 millimeter, and that's where I stayed the whole war. And the thing about 40 millimeter is that back then we didn't have OSHA. Earplugs were unheard of. So a lot of the guys lost their hearing. I was fortunate I didn't lose my hearing, but I did lose my sense of balance. So all in all, I came out of the war without a scratch. One of the lucky ones.
Okay, after Shakedown, the Monterey then went to the Pacific?
After the Shakedown, the Monterey went back through the Panama Canal.
Now
And
relieve the watch. On deck, section 3. Relieve the watch.
that's 12 o'clock. He's right on the ball. After the Shakedown, we went back through the Panama Canal, went to San Francisco, and then on to Alameda, and took on a load of P-47 Navy planes and transported them to Hawaii for the Army.
How about your own air crew? You didn't have your own air crew at that time?
The thing about an aircraft carrier back during the war, you didn't enter port with your air crew on board and your ammo. We had to stop and unload our ammo at a designated place before we went into port. I don't know, it must have been some regulation that they had during the war, but no ship, or especially aircraft carriers, entered with ammo and aircraft on board.
So then, did your air crew come aboard in Hawaii?
Air crew come aboard after we were out to sea.
Okay.
The air crew flew on board. We never left port with our own planes on deck. Now, as aircraft carriers went, we were small. Our pilots had to be special trained. most of your carriers were of Essex class. They had 13 to 1,500 foot of flight deck. We only had a little over 800. And
Smaller than the battleship New Jersey.
right, and we still were able to put 40 planes in the air in combat. So our pilots really had to be special trained for that type of carrier. But at that time, they had 9 of them. So it was easy to rotate squadrons. But we used to kid the pilots, what's this ship look like from up there where you guys are? And their famous remark was, it looked like a cemetery plot, rectangular shape. But
Did the Monterey have catapults at that time for launching planes?
2 forward catapults,
And
steam generated. But that was the only way we could get our first flight off, because there was, for a flat deck takeoff, there wasn't enough room for them to clear the flight deck. Your first 6 or 8 had to be catapulted off.
Did the Essex class have catapults at that time?
All carriers had
Did they?
catapults. Even the CVEs, which they used for jeep carriers, they could fly them off, but they couldn't land them because they didn't have enough deck. So they catapulted the planes off, and they were replacements for the fleet. In other words, if our squadrons went out and lost 3 or 4 planes that day, they would radio to the CVE, the jeep carrier. They would send over the planes and pilots to go with them.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about the Typhoon? The Typhoon Cobra, December 1944.
December 16th of 1944, we were in a safe harbor in the Philippine Islands. And we got sailing orders. Now, at the time, they said, while you're out, you're going to confront a low system, meaning a storm. But compared to today's weather and the way they're able to predict weather and tell you weeks in advance what the weather's going to be like on a certain day, back then, weather predictions were antiquated. The only thing that we really had going for us was a guy in the aerology department would fill out a balloon with helium, take it up on the flight deck and release it, and he would track it to see how fast the upper winds were and what direction the winds were traveling in.
And in New Jersey.
And
All guests and crew members are asked to help maintain Battleship New Jersey's heating and air conditioning boundaries by closing all doors behind them when entering and exiting the ship, and closing any exterior doors found open when traveling about the ship.
he's got to be from New York.
He is. That's John. I know who he is. Brooklyn, I think.
Yeah. But getting back to the weather, they had no real way of predicting. When we headed into the typhoon, we had no idea how big it was. We had no idea how strong it was. The only thing we knew was that it was a thunder shower squall, and we would be in and out of it in a few short minutes. Well, it didn't turn out that way.
In fact, Weather Central in Hawaii was off 200 miles in
They were off several
Where-
hundred miles,
where the typhoon was.
and as to the severity of it, they had no contact with any ship in it and knew nothing about it. And as it turns out, I said we left port on the 16th, but part of us leaving port on the 16th was revealed to us later that Admiral Halsey was a good friend of General MacArthur's. And Admiral Halsey promised General MacArthur the day he wanted to go back to Bataan. Remember back when they abandoned Bataan, General MacArthur said, "I shall return." Well, that day came up, and Halsey wanted to make sure that MacArthur had plenty of air and sea support. To make a long story short, we never got there. Needless to say, we never got there. When we hit the storm on the 17th, I was on watch on the bridge, and Lieutenant Gerald Ford was the duty officer that night. So I spent 4 hours beginning part of the storm on the bridge with Gerald Ford as duty officer that night.
Which watch was that?
That was at 12 to 4. And at 4, we were starting to head into the storm, and the seas were starting to kick up enough so that when you went below and got in your bunk, you strapped yourself in. We never got to our bunk. Partway down, they decided to call general quarters. Now, during the storm, everything we had on the flight deck went over the side. Because at one point we took a 39-degree roll, and everything we had topside went over. And that's when...
That included the planes. Right?
That was the planes, the tow motors, bomb carriers. Luckily, the planes on the flight deck had been defueled, and their armament had been put below. That's when Gerald Ford almost lost it, because we took that 39-degree roll. He slipped and went across the flight deck, and the only thing that saved him was our flight deck was wood, railroad ties, and what they had was a metal edging. And below that is a catwalk. Well, the catwalks were only like 24 inches wide. But when we took that roll, he fell, slipped, and went across the flight deck. And the only thing that saved him was he grabbed that metal edging and was able to put his feet down on the catwalk. That's the only thing that kept him from going over the side at the beginning of the storm. But what happened to make us go to general quarters, as I said, we lost everything topside.
7 planes went over the side, I believe, from the flight deck.
Well, we had more than that on the flight deck.
So you lost more than 7. Okay, the official report.
The official word I'm here to tell you, from my personal observation, the official word on the losses in the whole typhoon were only done for the benefit of Tokyo Rose, so she could broadcast it. 150 planes, no, we lost much more than that. 700 and, I forget the change count of personnel.
790 is the official.
We lost more than that. The one thing I don't understand, I know I saw a light cruiser go down that day, and there's no mention of it in any of the history books, and I don't even know the name of it. But
You saw it go down.
I watched it from my gun mount, and I know it wasn't a destroyer.
The official report is just 3 destroyers went
That's
down.
the official report. And here again, I think that was strictly propaganda, because Tokyo Rose picked up on everything. How she come up with some of the guys' names and all that were on different ships is still a mystery. But
What caused, you were about to tell us what caused the going to general quarters.
our planes on the hangar deck were never defueled and never had their armament put away. They still had their bombs on board. and they still were loaded with aviation gas. They were tied down, all except one. One broke loose, cut electric wires, ruptured a gas tank, and the rest is history, as you see in some of the books, the pictures. Our ship was totally emancipated, for lack of a better word, because what happened during the height of the fire and the worst part of the storm was in, we lost power. And without power, we had no water to fight fires, we had no electricity, we were helpless. And a lot happened. Back then we didn't have air conditioning on board ship. We had fresh air, fans and air intake. Well, the fans, as long as they were operating, were great. They were bringing the fire from the hangar deck right on below deck into our living quarters. And it also allowed the water to build up to the lower level of the watertight hatches, which was probably about a foot deep in the first 3 decks of living quarters. The fire spread, and what I'm about to tell you now is something I told you before. The seas were rough. When waves were breaking over the bridge and the hangar deck, you got to talk about waves and seas that were at least 100 foot high. The winds were over 100 knots. And with no power, we were going nowhere. Now, going ahead a little bit, when Gerald Ford passed away as president, I was one of 3 that was selected to go to New York for his funeral. When I read his obituary in the New York Times, I discovered something that we were never told until I learned about it at that time. And that was an order from Admiral Halsey to our captain, Captain Ingersoll, that if we couldn't get power up and maintain our position in the task force, we were to abandon ship. Now, I don't have to tell you, and I'm no mathematician, but to abandon ship in seas like that, in a storm like that, I wouldn't be here today. No way. Captain Ingersoll called Lieutenant Ford to the bridge and gave him an assignment. Take whatever personnel he needed, go to one of the boiler rooms. We had 4. Take the dead out, take the injured out, put the fire out, and get a boiler started. And he did. They got one boiler started. It allowed us to go 8 knots forward. But the winds were taking us 20 knots backwards. But I'm here to say that if it hadn't have been for Gerald Ford, I wouldn't be here today. No way could I survive in seas like that. And when I say that your figures are a little wrong, it's not your fault. It's the way history wrote itself. I've learned over the years that people write books and write newspapers and write movies to sell. So they're allowed to write and interpret whatever they think's going to sell. More newspapers, more books, make the movie more interesting. I can sit through any combat movie and point things out to you that are wrong. My wife gets upset with me for doing that. But I'm told it's a thing that they're allowed to use called Simulator 2. But as far as the Typhoon goes, we did survive the Typhoon. However, we were put out of commission. We could no longer conduct flight operations. Our hangar deck was completely gone as far as the fire. All parts, spare parts, were destroyed. Our whole squadron of planes was gone, and we had 40 on board. Our whole squadron was gone. Our flight deck was warped and burnt. We could no longer land or take off. In other words, we were completely useless from the typhoon, and therefore we were sent back to Bremerton Navy Yard in Washington for repairs.
During the height of the storm, where were you, Owen?
During the height of the storm, I had to take, when they sounded general quarters, I had to take outside catwalks from officers' country, which was forward of the flight deck. To those that don't know what it is, it's the front part of the ship. But I had to take outside catwalks and take them all the way back to my gun mount. Now, the way the aircraft carrier was built, you had your flight deck, but you had catwalks underneath of the flight deck. In other words, the flight deck covered mostly the main part of what the ship was, the body of the ship. But you had about 12 foot of catwalk out over the water to get to your gun mount. And what we were busy doing was dumping our ammo over the side. We had to jettison. You want to turn that off a second, or aren't you allowed to? I just didn't want to be quoted as saying how close we were to losing the war.
Well, you should tell us that. That's
But
your opinion.
it's not in your history books. It's not in your history books. And I tell the students today when I go to the school, yeah. But for that one act, if their Navy had been that close that day, we wouldn't have stood a chance. Not a chance.
How much do you blame Halsey for the losses from the typhoon?
I don't blame Halsey at all.
Who do you blame? Anybody?
Yeah. Wearology back in Hawaii, because they had the information and they didn't pass it on in time to the fleet. Now, I know about what happened after the typhoon and later on in history, that they tried to court-martial Halsey for almost losing the Pacific Fleet. And they tried court-martialing 2 other admirals, namely Senator McCain that we have in Washington now. It was his father, who was Admiral McCain, and his grandfather at the time was Admiral McCain. And the Navy or Congress, whoever does it, tried court-martialing all 3 admirals for leading the fleet into the typhoon. But do I blame Halsey? No. I didn't blame Halsey for it then, and I don't blame him now posthumously for leading the fleet into there, because of, as I said before, the difference between then and now in your weather predictions, it's like prehistoric times. Weather predictions just weren't thought of back then.
Yeah, they didn't have satellites to show where the typhoon was back
We
then.
didn't have anything.
Yeah,
The
you're
only
very-
thing we knew is if we approached, there was a dark cloud off in the distance. That's all. So we had nothing.
the-
And did we lose men? Yeah. I know we lost more than they said. I know that.
The official report says on the Monterey, 3 were killed in the fires and 34 were injured. You believe the numbers were higher than that?
If I remember right, it was maybe 6. I know 2 of them died wearing rescue apparatus in what is called an escape chute that run all the way from the keel of the ship up to the hangar deck. They suffocated in there.
Now, there were some that were seriously injured in the storm. Some might have died later, but right after the storm, they reported 3 deaths.
They were on the hangar deck when the explosions happened. And as I said, for a while, we had no power. We had no water to the fire hoses. We had nothing. We were dead in the water. The only light they had was coming from the fires that were burning on the hangar deck. And the hangar deck, we had to close what is called sea curtains, if you know what I mean. If you were in Philadelphia, they're the things you pull down at night to close off your glass windows of a storefront. But on the elevators, they were called sea curtains. And so we lost guys in that. Had to bring it up.
You want to pause for a minute?
Yeah.
The ships that were sunk, we passed by a couple of them where all that was visible was their fantails. And even in the height of the storm, we could hear those guys in there beating on the bulkheads, trying to get out. And ain't a thing you could do. Nothing.
Okay, we're back on.
Okay, fire away.
Can you tell us anything about Gerald Ford's putting out the fires on the hangar deck? We had another a Monterey seaman we interviewed earlier. He said there was some sort of a deluge tank there which they couldn't get access to dump the water. Do you know anything about that?
I know there was a deluge tank simply for fires on the hangar deck. The reason they couldn't get to it was because that's where most of the burning wreckage turned up. And it was impossible to get. But don't let anybody tell you that steel is steel and steel don't burn and steel is, when it comes to water, no worry, you're behind steel, don't worry. The sea will damage steel and fire will burn steel when it gets hot enough. And they couldn't get to the deluge tank because it was impossible to get to it. So for the same reason that on the after end of the hangar deck or the after elevator, they could not get to some of the fire hydrants or outlets that we had there. Everything had to be done from midships.
There was a story that somebody did eventually get to the controls for the deluge tank and dump them. Do you know about that?
No, I don't know about that.
Okay. We were trying to identify the sailor who did that.
This is Chuck Hamilton.
Too. Okay, we're back.
We're back.
We were talking about the deluge tank on
Yeah,
the,
I knew where the
in hangar
deluge
deck.
tanks were. They were against the bulkhead of the elevators, but like I said, on the fantail, a lot of the wreckage on the hangar deck wound up in that elevator pit and you couldn't get to them. How one guy got to them, I don't know, because I was up above those and off to the starboard side, and we were busy getting the ammo out of our magazine and throwing it over the side, believe it or not. We didn't have far to throw it because there was lots of times when the ship took a roll to the starboard side. I was on the catwalk under the gun mount, but I was actually in the ocean. We took some deep rolls.
So your gunman actually went down to the water level during the rolls.
Right.
That must have been scary.
We had a battalion of Marines, a detachment of Marines on board as ship's company. Now, during normal times, they stand guard for the captain, but they also manned a battery of like 10 or 12 20-millimeter guns on a special gun mount. And we hit one wave, and luckily they didn't put the Marines out that day, because one wave and it took that whole gun mount right off, like it was never there.
The official record says there was a man fell overboard during the storm. Do you know anything about that? Can you tell us anything about it?
Yeah. He fell overboard at the forward elevator. And the next wave brought him back in the after elevator.
Wow.
So how lucky can you get? But the same wave that took him overboard brought him back in the after elevator at the end of the ship.
One of the problems that I found in the research was that one of the problems with that, the design of that class of carrier, was that the ventilation ducts opened into the hangar deck, so that the fires, the burning gasoline was actually able to get down to the lower decks through those ventilation ducts.
Like I said, we had, back then air conditioning on board ship was unheard of. And where we were at in the South Pacific, around noontime every day, it got to be 125 degrees on our flight deck. That's how the temperature was. The only air that we had below decks was through a ventilating system of fans that sucked the fresh air, like from the hangar deck, and blew it below deck. Now, when the fire broke out, it sucked the fire up and brought the fire down to the living quarters, which is on the second and third decks below. By the same token, when the water came in, it also sucked the water up and down. But then when we lost power, we had nothing. No ventilation. And whatever fire was there was burning, and whatever water it had sucked up was in there. But these were huge ventilating fans that were on the hangar deck.
How do you feel about Gerald Ford not getting recognized for his bravery during that?
He was recognized.
Was he?
He was given, I'll look for it later on. I have pictures where he was recognized and given a medal for it.
Some people say he should have got the Congressional Medal of Honor for that.
He should have, because he saved a crew of about 1,500 men. He should have been recognized more so than he was. But what they did, they transferred him off, put him in charge of a college, some kind of a college teaching, and that's where he remained to the end of the war. Now, the thing I remember about Gerald Ford, he was quite a sportsman on board ship. Played basketball and whatever else that we had at the time that could be used. Usually what they did, they dropped an elevator and put up a basketball rack on each side.
We have some pictures of Ford playing basketball on board.
Contrary to later years when he became president, he was not a klutz. He didn't stumble over doorways, and he didn't fall getting on and off of airplanes. He was steady-footed, young college graduate, played for the University of Michigan, and quite a guy. Now, after all the interviews and all, when I was supposed to go to New York for his funeral, I got a call from a reporter from USA Today. And her main interest was, what was it like after hours? Did you guys go out and drink a lot and all? I don't know where she got the concept from, but that wasn't the Navy that I was in. Maybe in the movies. But officers didn't associate with the lowly enlisted men, and no, we didn't go out and drink and have bar fights and all. It just wasn't that way.
What did you do?
During our off hours, well, if a guy was lucky enough and could catch 2 cockroaches on board ship, we'd paint them different colors and hold races and take bets on the winner. Other than that, it was relaxed reading. At that time, the University of Hawaii had courses that the guys in the fleet could take through correspondence courses. So a lot of the guys, the average age of the members of our ship was like 21 years old. So I had just reached 18, so I was on the lower side. But the average age of the people on board our ship, of the like 1,500, was 21 years old. Pilots were young. The gunners in the planes were young, what I called high school kids. Because some of the Navy planes, like the SBDs and the DBMs, were 2-man and 3-man airplanes, which mean they had a gun turret on board, and his job was to keep the enemy aircraft away. So yes, we had young members on board our ship.
Did you ever meet Jerry Ford while you were on the ship?
Only occasionally. It was, back then he was a lieutenant general, junior grade. And the only time you got to meet him was roll call, but he wasn't famous then. He was just Lieutenant Ford. He wasn't a famous man. He hadn't been noted in Washington. So I didn't know him any different than I did the rest of the officers.
What did you think of Captain Ingersoll?
Captain Ingersoll was, let's see, he was our second captain. Yeah. Captain Lester T. Hunt was our first captain. But Captain Ingersoll took over when Captain Hunt made Rear Admiral. And they thought so much of him, they brought him back to the States and made him commandant of a yacht club somewhere in California.
Of the yacht club?
Yeah, then they called them Commodores. That's what they called them then. Right. But Ingersoll was a good captain. He wasn't afraid to lead his men. He wasn't one that would go and hide for during air raids or anything. And he was an all-around good captain. Now, I think I got some pictures there where a movie was made with Gary Cooper. And I think Gary Cooper played part Captain Ingersoll in that movie, but the ship wasn't named or anything. It was strictly Hollywood stuff.
There were reports in some of the books that Ingersoll was recognized that you were in a Typhoon much sooner than the fleet command did on board the New Jersey. Can you comment on that?
We had our own, on an aircraft carrier, you have your own, what they call aerologists, weather people. And you conduct your own reports, and then you send them in to the flagship, and they're supposed to disseminate them there and see how many say this is a worse typhoon, how many said it's not. It all depends on the position of the ship in a task force. Now, a task force could take up as much as 50 to 60 square miles at one time in the ocean, because you have your carriers in the center. The carriers were always the plum pudding of the enemy. They always wanted to get carriers. And then around them, they had the battleships, and around them, the heavy cruisers, and then the light cruisers, and then your destroyers. So by the time you get all those ships spread out over an ocean, you're covering at least maybe 50 square miles. So our ship may be on the outer fringes, while 50 miles away, some other ship is in dead center. And we happen to be one of the outer rings of the aircraft carriers. And yes, we did radio. Our radio operators radioed in that it was much severer than they had predicted. But as I said, we lost all of our planes, so that didn't leave many planes for the other ships, and I'm sure their damage was as great or greater than ours.
There's some conflicts about what Jerry Ford's duties were on board the ship. Do you remember?
Okay. On board ship, as I remember, his main duty was gunnery officer, and that was mainly during general quarters. Other than that, he had the title of recreation and entertainment, meaning basketball games. We had boxing matches. His job was to set those up. But he was mainly entertainment and recreation.
There was one book reported that he was an assistant navigation officer. Can you
I had read that he was an assistant navigation officer. However, our navigational officer was a short, dumpy, three-stripe commander with a red beard. I remember him that well. And I think his name was Commander Atwell. So if Jerry Ford was an assistant navigator,
Maybe, in the military, sometimes jobs are assigned to you for 1 or 2 months, then it's assigned to somebody else. And
That's
they
right.
rotate these positions.
they rotate those
The
positions.
recreation officer, I was Lieutenant Marine, nobody ever wanted that job. It's one
No,
more
it's
thing.
it's one nobody wants because you got to go through
Right.
calisthenics in the morning.
You're the new man aboard, you get assigned to it, you hope to hand that off to somebody else, and so that, Ron, it might have been rotation of job positions taking
Right.
place while you're aboard a ship for 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 months.
Another way we were rotated was when Admiral Halsey was out there, we were known as the Fifth Fleet. We had a number of 58.3 or something like that. But then when we switched admirals and Admiral Spruance come out, we became the same ship, but we became Fleet 38.3.
Third Fleet versus
Third
Fifth
Fleet.
Yeah.
Spruance was Third Fleet.
No, Spruance was
Halsey
Fifth
was
Fleet.
Fifth Fleet.
No, you got it backwards. Halsey was Third Fleet, Spruance was Fifth
I know
Fleet.
what they had in print, but I know what we served under. And I know what's in print. I read it myself, and I said to myself, that's wrong. Spruance was third.
Really? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask one other question? What was the attitude of the crew towards the Japanese?
We were out there to do a job, and we were out there to fight the Japanese. Our only contact would be shooting them down when they came at us. Now, to answer your next part, after the war, we happened to live in an area where they brought busloads, carloads of the displaced Japanese. We live in a place or near a place called Seabrook, New Jersey. That was a food processing plant, and Mr. Seabrook brought an awful lot of the displaced Japanese to Seabrook, New Jersey. If you go back in history and read about the Japanese battalion of that was in the army that they had over in Europe, called the Go for Broke or the 442nd.
442nd.
217 of the residents that live in Seabrook were in the 442nd. So, and we were police officers there for 20 years also. So, yeah, you have to take a different attitude. You can't blame the people that started the war. You can't blame the older people that have been here all their lives for something that somebody else started thousands of miles away. And we have a lot of friends in that Japanese settlement, even today. So, the feeling, I have no feeling, no ill feeling with them. I have no ill feeling about the guy that tried to drop a torpedo in our lap. Of course, I know he never made it back, but
Was your ship involved in any air combat against the Japanese aircraft or Japanese ships?
let me take a minute here. I got a scoreboard.
Okay, the camera's back on now.
Okay.
Now, you're going to show us a picture of yourself at 18?
Yeah, that's over here.
See if I can get in a little closer on this. Okay, that's good.
You look at that, and you look at today, something horrible had to happen along the way.
First time we're done.
And the other document, tell us what that is,
This
please.
is a scoreboard of our island invasions. It's missing 2 stars. There's only 11 there. We actually earned 13. This is planes shot down in the air by both our combat planes and our ship's guns. Over here, the first one is naval vessels sunk. Over here is merchant ships sunk. Here is islands bombed. All of these ducks on the bottom were destroyed by our air groups. They're lame ducks, and they were destroyed on the ground. They never got in the air. Now, as far as combat goes, we were lucky. We were never hit with a torpedo. We were never had a bomb dropped on us. We were strafed a lot.
Did you get credit for any kills? Any planes? You
One I
yourself.
don't have is on the gun mount. Yeah, we had 3 flags on our gun mount.
3 planes shot down?
Mm-hmm. On a ship like that, the carrier, your guns have what they call stops on them. In other words, if you swing around, you can't fire over the flight deck. You swing around at the waterline, you can only go even with the waterline. You can't shoot below the waterline. Your gun mount's got a stop in it. Won't fire. So for us to get a torpedo bomber, we had to get him while he was quite a ways out when he was making his approach. Not after he dropped it. It's too late then. And the closest we ever came was on a gun mount Jerry Ford was on. They watched a torpedo pass under their gun mount, but it kept going and it nailed an Australian cruiser, which was the next ship in line of sight.
Was that a friendly fire?
No, that was not a friendly fire.
Okay.
But we had a lot of casualties. You get an aircraft carrier like this, and you got the planes in flight operation, all the engines are turning up, you're going to have casualties because invariably 2 or 3 times a week somebody would forget and stand up. It's not a pretty sight. So we always had burials at sea. Today they preserve the body and bring the body back. But during our time,
In wartime, that's tough to do.
it's tough to do. And when I go to memorials and I see the brass plaques and all, it's nice to have them there. But I have to remember that the guys I knew and the guys that died during my time, they're somewhere on the tides of time, because nothing stays put in the ocean. Someday those body bags may start and wash up on a remote island somewhere. Who knows? Just recently with the one that they hung over in Iraq, and they took his body out to sea and buried. He ain't there. The tides of time have taken that body far away. They will never, ever find it.
And they can be preserved deep in the ocean. The water's cold, and that preserves the body if it's not attacked by fish or so.
During our time out there, we hit some places in the Pacific where we could not record bottom.
It was that
It's-
deep in the
It was
Mariana.
that deep that as far as our electrical instruments were concerned, there was no bottom. The deepest places we hit was something like 16, 17,000 feet.
Owen, we're just about out of time. And I'm going to wrap it up here. We appreciate your coming.
I could
To
go
visit
on
with-
forever since she's turned. Between her and our daughters, which one of them's a retired school teacher, I come out of the shell a little bit.
It was great